Shalom. Shalom, everybody. Rabbi Yehuda Glick from Jerusalem. We are deep, as you all know, deep in the coronavirus, and we are also getting ready for Passover. Passover will be in 1 week from today. Today is Tuesday, March 31st, and Pesach will begin Wednesday night. Wednesday night in 1 week and 1 day. It will be the 7th of March in the evening. And we are all with our prayers. Today I was caught in my prayers with the verse from the book of Psalms, and I gracefully trust in you. I trust in your grace, and I will be happy in your salvation. I think that we all will be happy in God's salvation. We will all be happy to see the hand of God and His salvation to the world as soon as possible. And I think the way I read the verse today is, your grace is not only the fact that God brings salvation, but the fact that we can have trust in you. V'ani b'chasdecha v'tachti. And it's a graceful favor of yours, God, that you are allowing us to have trust in you. And that's also a great favor that you are doing for us, that we can, even in such difficult times, even when we see a lot of sorrow in front of ourselves, even in these days where we're going through so much unknown, so many dead ends, so much suffering around the world. Even in these days when the Satan and the angel of death is running around the streets, we are blessed to be able to have trust in you. Our faith in you, our faith and understanding that everything that you will do in this world is for the good, is one of the things that definitely gives us the strength to survive, to continue, to develop new routines, and to celebrate our faith. So that in itself is a great favor that you did to us, that you give us the ability to have faith in you. And as I said, next week we will be celebrating the Passover. We will be celebrating the Exodus, We will be celebrating the Exodus from Egypt. And one of the great moments in the Exodus from Egypt was the splitting of the Red Sea. I want to invite you to read with me together chapter 14 in the book of Exodus, which describes this story. And it recounts the miracle of the splitting of the Red Sea. And let us see what the Torah is trying to teach us in these wonderful verses. I invite you to hold the Bible in front of you. We are reading the book of Exodus, chapter 14. The story tells of the splitting of the Red Sea. It's followed in chapter 15 with the song at the sea, the song of faith, the song of the people of Moses and the people of Israel, crying out after their salvation. Chapter 14 deals with this great miracle. And the question is, what is the aim? What is the essence? What is the significance of this great miracle? Why did God take us to this miracle, which is narrated in chapter 14 of the book of Exodus? Well, when we read the verses, I think explicitly we find twice in God's words to Moses an explanation. I'm reading in Exodus chapter 14, verse 4. And God says to Moses, I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue you and I shall be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, and Egypt will know that I am the Lord. Which means that God is saying that he's doing this great miracle so that the people of Egypt should know that he is the Lord. That same idea is expressed one more time in verse 17 of the same chapter. We're in Exodus chapter 14, verse 17. Behold, God says, I will harden the heart of Egypt, and they will come after you. And I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, with his chariots and his horsemen. Egypt will know that I am the Lord when I am honored through Pharaoh and his chariots and his horsemen. So we see here, both in verse 17, 18, and in verse 4, twice, the explanation of the reason that this great miracle is taking place is to show the people of Egypt that God is the Lord. But it seems that there's a very difficult to understand this idea. If the purpose of the miracle is for Egypt to know God, after all, the Egyptians who pursue Israel are drowned in the sea. Not one of them remained, as it says in verse 28. Lo nish'ar bahem ad echad, not even one remained. So how can we say that the miracle here is to show that the people of Egypt, that God is the God? So we can try to maybe give two explanations. One, we can say that those who remain, maybe those who didn't come out of Egypt, those who stayed home, will remain. Those who remained. The other thing we can say is not only those who remained back in Egypt, but those who drowned. Just before they drown, they will know that I am God. And in a way, we can say this soul reaction of the Egyptian, the realization of what we just described, really appears in verse 25. Vayomer Mitzrayim, I'm reading chapter 14, verse 25. Vayomer Mitzrayim, and Egypt said, Anusa mipnei Yisrael, ki Adonai nilcham lahem b'Mitzrayim. Let us flee for Israel, for God fights for them against Egypt. So here we can see, Shalom, Ade Rotilo. I don't know where you're from, but Shalom, Shalom. So Egypt said, let us flee from before Israel, for God fights for them against Egypt. So here we see that really what God said is going to happen, happens. God says that he is going to fight those who have offended his people, and we see that's happening. So if this is the knowledge of God to which the verses refer, it only lasts for such a short time. We don't know, there's no mention made of the Egyptian nation. Shalom Adeh from the hospital. Wow, it's so wonderful to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, one of our followers just came out of the hospital from Madrid after he was ill and hospitalized for the corona disease. Wow, welcome Adeh. So no mention is mentioned that the people of Egypt are knowing that God, what took place, or knowing that God could. In any event, our story describes no widespread recognition of God, and we find a hint of it in the Song of the Sea. In the Song of the Sea, the following chapter, in chapter 15, we see in verse 14, Sham'u amim yirgazun. The nations will hear and will be afraid. And there's a list of nations, but even here, in the list of nations, Egypt is not mentioned. We have the Philistines, we have Edom, Moab, the Canaanites, but Egypt is not included. So in God's words, as we quoted before, the events of the story have an additional objective. I shall be honored through Pharaoh and entire army, meaning revenge on Pharaoh and Egypt, for their sins against Israel. For when the Holy One avenges against those, the wicked ones, his name is made great and honored. So anyway, the realization of this objective, as we said, is described in our story at length, that the avenge causes to be known the people of the knowledge of God. A closer look at the story of the splitting of the sea, with an analysis of its structure, will reveal that alongside this explicit and over-doubled purpose of the events, there's another important objective that pertains specifically to Israel. So as we said before, the knowledge of Israel, the knowledge of the Egyptians, we have a little problem finding. But the knowledge of the other people, the others in the world, that we do find is knowledge that people know that God is honored. But I think there's another major purpose. And I want to study together thoroughly this chapter, and I believe we will be able to find a very strong explanation of the need of this great miracle of splitting of the Red Sea. So join me. We're going to start studying verse by verse, chapter 14 of the book of Exodus. Chapter 14 of the book of Exodus is divided into two parts. The first part is from verse 1 to verse 14. It begins with the people of Israel leaving Egypt, the people of Egypt finding out that they ran away and starting to chase them. And it concludes with the people of Israel panicking when they see the approaching Egyptian army. And Moses calms them down. Don't be afraid. He says to them, stand and watch the salvation of God, which he will perform for you today. For as you have seen Egypt today, you shall not see them again forever. God will fight for you, and you shall be silent. So that's the first half. The second half is the exact description of the miracle of the drowning of the people of Egypt. But because it appears that even Moses himself was not sure of their exact meaning. How would Israel never see Egypt again? What was the reason? What was about to happen? So for this reason, Moses cries out to God. It doesn't say in the verse that he cries out to God, but it does say in the response of God. In verse 15, God says to Moses, what are you screaming to me? So we know that God that Moses screamed to God. So what we still have to understand. Moses is crying out to God and elevating the distress of Israel. God says to him, why are you crying to me? Speak to the people of Israel and that they should proceed. And you lift your hand, your staff, and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and the people of Israel will come through the sea on dry ground. So this speech by God would seem to start the story over. And it really corresponds thematically and linguistically to what he said at the beginning of the story. In the beginning of the story, we had, and God said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to go ahead. And that's in verse 1. And here again we see in verse 15, and God says to Moses, tell the people of Israel, and they should go ahead. So God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will be honored through the Pharaoh and all of his army, and Egypt will know. And here we see again, God says to Moses, speak to the people of Israel, and they should go forward, and the people of Israel will come into the midst of the sea and the dry land. And God continues exactly what he said at the beginning. In the beginning, in verse 4, he says, I will harden the heart of Egypt. And here again he says, in verse 17, I will harden the heart of Egypt, and they will come after, and I shall honor through Pharaoh and his whole army, his chariots, and his horsemen, and Egypt will know that I am the Lord, when I am honored through Pharaoh and his chariots and his horsemen. So we have two halves, but the division between the two halves has a firm basis, not only the change that comes about in the plot, but also in the clear formal parallel between the openings of both halves. The first half of the story in verses 1 to 14 describe the event that took place on the Red Sea, while the second half, verses 15 to 31, describe mainly what will take place inside the sea, and at the end, of course, on the other side. Before examining the nature of the parallel between the two halves of the story, and the significance of this parallel and of the structure of the whole story as a whole, we have to examine each half individually. So the first half can also be divided into two parts. the first part, verses 1 to 8. In itself, it contains 2 units. Verses 1 to 4. God commands Moses to mislead Pharaoh by guiding the people of Israel back on the route they came towards Egypt and its fulfillment. And verses 5 to 8, Pharaoh's decision to pursue the people of Israel and the beginnings of putting it into action. This section concludes with the surprising words that the people of Israel went out with high hand. These words, of course, remind us of what we already saw in chapter 13, that the people of Israel went out armed from the land of Egypt. But it's pretty strange. What are they doing here? I mean, we're talking about the hardening of the heart. Pharaoh hardens his heart and chasing the people of Israel. Why are they telling us that the people of Israel came out strong-handed? Unless we would expect the people of Israel to fight back. But that's not what we're expecting. What are they doing here, these words, at the end of the unit that describes Pharaoh's pursuit? In a way, we can say maybe that these words are simply an ironic introduction to what will be revealed in the second part of this half. They went out with a high hand, they had no concerns at all until they saw Pharaoh and his nation pursuing them. The second part of this first half, in verse 9, opens with the pursuit of Egypt after the people of Israel. It's not a repetition, because the previous pursuit was hidden from the eyes of the people of Israel. The people of Israel didn't know. But from here, from verse 9, suddenly the people of Israel see that the people of Egypt are chasing them. And from now on, what was hidden in the eyes, now it happens in the very midst of them. And they reach them encamped by the sea. This eye contact established between 2 camps. And the people of Israel raised their eyes, and behold, Egypt, the people of Israel, the strong hand of the people of Israel, turns into terrible fear and crying out to God. Immediately after, they launch into a speech. And what do they say? Let's listen carefully. And they say to Moses, was it for the lack of graves in Egypt that you've taken us to die in the desert? What is this that you have done to us to take us out of Egypt? Is this not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve Egypt, for it is better for us to serve Egypt than to die in the desert. Look what happens. The whole total opposite of what we understood till now. In reality, Egypt was a land of servitude, throwing the sons into the river. Was supposed to be the symbol of freedom, of life. And in the speeches of the people of Israel, the desert suddenly becomes the place where people die, while Egypt, which is mentioned 5 times in their speech, albeit a place of labor, it's a place where people live, and they even merit, because they're a respectable burial place. And in this speech, the people of Israel regret having left Egypt, and their hysterical reaction of those who left the country armed and with a high hand. I think we recall the verse in Psalm 106. Our forefathers in Egypt did not appreciate your wonders. At the sea, they rebelled at the Red Sea. But in the context over here, where it appears in our story, it gives rise to derision on the part of the reader. This is like a classic situation of irony, where the complainers are not aware of what we, the readers, have known since the beginning of the story. Because already in the beginning of the story, God told us that he did it purposely. And there's danger that is only apparent. The situation which has come about is an artificial. This was the first half of this chapter. And now let's go on to the second half of the chapter. The second half of the chapter, verses 15 to verses 31. This part is also divided into 2 parts. just like the first half. In verses 15 to 22, we have the miraculous splitting of the sea, allowing the people of Israel to enter into its midst and the people of Egypt to drown. In verses 23 to 31, we see the miraculous drowning in the sea of the Egyptians who were inside it. The description of the second miracle concludes in verse 28, 29, and 30, 31, we have a summarize of the event. Whereas in verse 29, where the people are walking with the water as a wall on each side, repeats the verse 22. And the reason for this repetition, of course, is that verse 22 is describing the actual event where the people of Israel are entering the sea, with the water forming a wall on each side. But verse 29 reviews the incident in recent past. It says halchu in past. Why did they do that? To contrast it with what happened to the Egyptians, which was previously described in verse 27 to 28. In other words, the two miracles described in this half of the story are not regarded independently. They should be seen in the light of one another. The Egyptians drowned and the people of Israel were saved. But throughout this half of the story, the leading motive, the leading word is hayam, the sea. This word hayam, so the two miracles are presented in the light of each other. The presentation of each miracle follows a common structure. There's a divine command, its fulfillment. Israel and Egypt are in the sea, the pursuit, and its conclusion. What we see here right now, we have a direct parallel between the two halves of our chapter. In the first half, we saw that God commanded and told the people to go ahead, and we saw the second part, the same thing exactly happened, where God told the people, go ahead, and he told them to go into the sea, and it will become dry land, and he would be tempted to enter himself into the midst of the sea. In the next part, in part 1, we saw that they're like description of the preparations for the pursuit. Pharaoh's preparation in the first half, getting ready to chase the people of Israel, and in the second half, God enabling the Jews to enter the sea towards the miracle. Then once again, we have an identical description of Pharaoh's pursuit in verse 9, where they're chasing to their encampment, and in verse 23, the Egyptians are chasing into the sea. Now, so we see there's great similarity between the two halves. We even have identical words sometimes. And the fact is that in the first half, the people of Israel are not aware of the true situation because they don't know the divine plan to mislead Pharaoh. And God is going to be honored through his army. Only in the second half is this part revealed to them fully. At the beginning, towards the end of the first half, we have a contrast between the people of Israel's distress, lifting up their eyes and seeing the Egyptians following them. And the Egyptians, the same thing happened to them when they entered the water in the second half. So too we see that in the first half, the people of Israel complained to Moses their fear of the approaching Egyptian army. And the story of the Egyptian being covered by the wars cancels the Israeli fear. And this, of course, is full cycle and only the end of the story, when the people of Israel finally believe in God and Moses, as opposed to their bitter complaints in the first half. And finally, we see there's a direct parallel in the end. In the end of the first half, Moses calming down using the words, "Behold, God's salvation, which you shall perform today." And this, of course, corresponds with the end of the second half. God saved Israel today. So what purpose do we have, Shalom, Rebbe Games? What purpose is served by the structure of the the problem here. Okay. I hope you will see it again. I hope so. In the first half, we had the story presents the tribulation facing the people of Israel. And the second half presents a solution. But if this was the true message of the story, the appropriate structure would not be a structure of a direct parallel. It would be a structure of problem and solution. But our story, there's a direct correspondence between the two halves of the chapter. What is the reason for this? And it seems, listen carefully, that the answer is simple. We're not here telling a story of true distress. From the very start, it's clear to the reader that the distress is artificial. And its purpose is that I may be honored through Pharaoh and the whole army. This being the case, the story is not one of distress and salvation, but rather a story of a divine plan and its realization in two stages. And what happens here? What happens here is that we have a correspondence, therefore, that part one describes the first stage in the plan of misleading Pharaoh, while part two describes the second half in the same realization. The two stages are similar. Both are aimed at the attainment of the same goal. It is the natural that they be presented direct correspondence. And now we're going to try to understand, we may still ask, so what is the point of the divine plan being divided into two stages? And why do they have to correspond between each other? Why not both of them combine into one divine message? Where Moses, about Pharaoh's heart being hardened, and he would pursue the people of Israel into the desert and ultimately into the sea. But the answer to this question, of course, lies not in the identical or similar units between the comparison between the two halves, but in the units that correspond inversely. The crux of the contrast in these units is between the reaction of the people of Israel to the events in the first half and the reality that reveals itself in the second half. The divine plan to be honored through Pharaoh, through the hardening of his heart, to pursue the people of Israel, is clear. It's clear to Moses and to us right from the beginning of the story. But even those who know this plan do not know how it's going to happen. It's perhaps for this reason that Moses does not share this knowledge with the people of Israel. They merely receive a command to return and encamp. And they did this. And Pharaoh will say to the people of Israel that they're lost. And Moses said, but he's not commanded to pass it on to the information to the people of Israel. So the people of Israel are aware of what's going on. When the people of Israel discover that they react with fear. And even Moses, more than they do, attempts to use this knowledge to calm them. He's unable to achieve the aim completely because he himself does not know how this salvation is going to come about. It appears, therefore, that there is an intentional dimension of irony in the great fear of the people of Israel expressed in verses 10 and 12. Why does God not tell them and Moses of his designs? It appears that God left them all in dark, precisely in order to obtain this frightened response. Why? Apparently the main aim of our story is to heal the people of Israel from their psychological enslavement to their Egyptian masters. Look, we have 600,000 people, a camp. How they're all fearing their pursuers. Why don't we have any of them fighting for their lives and for their children? And the answer is, of course, that the Egyptians were the masters of the people of Israel. And this generation, which had just left Egypt, had grown up under the yoke of the Egyptian slavery. And their spirit was downtrodden. How could they now fight against their masters with the people of Israel lowly and untrained in war? So what we may say that Israel had indeed been taken out of Egypt, but Egypt had not yet been taken out of them. Their armed exodus from Egypt with high hands, was to a large extent only an external issue. From a psychological perspective, the Egyptians were masters to the people of Israel. and their spirit was downtrodden. How could they now fight against their masters? It was at the Red Sea that the people of Israel were freed psychologically from their fear of the Egyptians. And in order to be healed of this psychological enslavement from this fear of the Egyptians, it was not sufficient that the people of Israel saw Egypt dead upon the seashore. The process of rehabilitation has no shortcuts. Sometimes, even a physical illness cannot be cured if the condition does not clearly present itself. But in psychological terms, there is an even greater need to reveal the problem lurking within, hidden even from the consciousness of the sufferer himself, in order that we may heal them. The purpose of the first half of the story is to bring the people of Israel great fear of their former masters from potential into actuality. And for this purpose, it was necessary for them to think that Pharaoh's pursuit of them was a regular enemy pursuit, endangering their lives. And at this stage, all their helplessness in the face of their oppressors was revealed. It was also revealed that their exodus from Egypt wasn't wholehearted yet. It was not yet. They now regretted it. And this actualization of their fear of Egypt was obviously meant for the purpose of healing and treatment. And this is, in fact, what happens in the second half. Only the reversal between their reaction when they saw the Egyptians pursuing and when they saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore, only at this time did it bring them to see the mighty wonders of God that he had performed upon the Egyptians, and to replace Shalom from Indonesia, and to replace their fear of the Egyptians with the awe of God. This process of the psychological and mental liberation from the fear of the Egyptians is a process with profound religious meanings. It's expressed through a play on words using two similar roots which appear throughout the units, a total of 7 times. We're talking about the root Yir'ah and Ra'ah. Moshe said to them, do not be afraid, Al Tira'u. Stand in Vir'u, to see and to fear, are 2 words in Hebrew which are very close. As you have seen Egypt today, read them, you shall not see them again. Israel saw them, and Israel was awe of their great wonders, and the nation feared God. And here, when Moses spoke to the nation that they still feared Egypt, by the end of the story, the nation did not fear Egypt, but they feared God. How was their fear of flesh and blood converted into fear of God? The answer is by seeing. This is what brought this about. They're seeing Egypt today, chasing after them in the first half of the story, causes within them a profound fear of Egypt. But Moses calls upon them to stand and see God's salvation. And when they see God's salvation, indeed, when they see Egypt dead upon the seashore, they recognize the great wonders that God has performed, his salvation. The sight of the eyes becomes the perception in their hearts, and it brings them to awe of God and to faith in him. Only now is the process of the exodus from slavery to eternal freedom complete. Now they're free in spirit as well as in body, and they're worthy and ready to sing the song of praise of God. And we have to do this to ourselves also, very often. In our regular life, we are totally dependent and we have fear from the regular life. And God wants to teach us sometimes. He sometimes develops a fear because we don't know the future, so that we should remember to have fear and awe of God himself. And therefore, after as we are going through today, I am sure that you and your families, the fear we feel today of the unknown will turn into the praise of God of salvation. Amen. And shalom from Jerusalem. I invite you all and I remind you all to visit our website, shalomjerusalem.org, to visit our YouTube channel of Shalom Jerusalem Foundation, and to keep in touch and following our teachings. I love you all. Shalom from Jerusalem. Shalom from Jerusalem.